Will you bow your heads with me then as we get into our service this morning? Our gracious Father in heaven, we are so privileged to be able to work for you, and I pray that you would open your word to us today, that you would prepare our hearts. Give us humility to accept whatever it is that you want to lay on our hearts today. Give me the words from on high that need to be said here today. In Jesus' name, amen. I kind of can divide today's message into two, because I have two things that I want to do. I want to talk about mission first, but I want to first of all talk about mission within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is a church on a mission. If we don't have a mission, we might as well not exist. And so allow me to talk specifically about the of mission in our church particularly, and then we'll open up the Bible and go into some things there as well. I work for the Office of Adventist Mission, and Adventist Mission is an umbrella for a couple of things that happens, and one of those things is the Office of Global Mission. And the Office of Global Mission, in case anybody doesn't know, that is the proactive arm of the church that is tasked with establishing the Adventist Church in places and among people groups where it has not yet been established, so that the gospel of Jesus Christ can be spread to the entire world. Okay, that's our mission, and global mission in particular. In the early days of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we didn't have an organization to help drive mission forward. We relied on individuals. So some of our pioneers, like James White, he cut hay and he split wood to make money for evangelism. And any money that he didn't spend on the basics, like food, was pushed into mission. And it worked. The movement grew to, 20 million now, or we're on the world? In fact, it grew so much that eventually they recognized the need to organize. You know, it's one thing to work with a small group of people without an organization, but when you get too big, you have to organize in order to move forward with any sort of order at all. But organization costs money. And so all of the money that had been pushed into frontline mission, for instance, they realized, hey, we need pastors. We need to pay our pastors. And so some of the money that was pushed into frontline mission went to pay pastors. And that was good. I mean, it was necessary. But then they said, oh, we need church buildings also. And so some of the money that had been pushed into frontline mission was diverted to church buildings. And then they needed schools and hospitals and whatever, different things like this. And so money that had been going to frontline mission was moved into those things. Now, that's not bad. I don't want to say that this was a problem, because these are all necessary. Offices and hospitals and schools and churches and pastors, these are all necessary for an organization, even from a mission perspective. So our growth as a church was good. The problem is that as church membership grew, giving to mission did not. Giving to mission, if you look at the line of giving to mission since our church started, it's basically flat. Membership has done this. Okay? Membership has skyrocketed. Mission giving has stayed flat. I have heard that for every $10 that a church member gave in tithe back in the beginning, they gave an average of $6 to mission. Okay? Today, anybody want to venture a guess? And if you were here first service, keep your mouth shut. Anybody want to venture a guess what mission giving is today? For every $10 in tithe, how much the average church member gives to mission? 28 cents. That's the average. 28 cents. We had begun, a long time ago actually, to spend more money on maintaining and growing our infrastructure than we were putting into frontline mission. In other words, members were giving more to what we had needed at home than to pushing work out to where it wasn't established. You know, an army that puts more resources into the places that have already been conquered than it does into the places that have not yet been conquered doesn't win the war. Same is true for mission. So not only have our institutional priorities shifted over time, our individual priorities have also shifted over time. That's why in 1990 we as a church said, hey, we recognize that we're not pushing into mission frontiers the way that we once were. We've strayed from our primary task of taking the gospel to the entire world. So our answer was to create the Office of Global Mission, which has a single task. And that is to establish our church in places and among people groups that do not have the church established in that place or that area or that group. Global Mission was created to be the voice in our church of unreached people calling out to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, please come share Jesus with us, because we don't have anybody in our group that can do it. Global Mission is a first responder. Global Mission is like the Marines. We're the first ones into new beachheads of mission. And we send in Global Mission pioneers, we call them, to raise up new groups of believers among those who have nothing. Global Mission pioneers are, for the most part anyway, local people. They already know the language, they already know the culture, they don't have that learning curve, and they take it to their own people or people that are very close by. We help them by providing a stipend and training and housing and literature and things like this that they need. Right now we have approximately, it's always changing, but we have approximately 2,000 Global Mission pioneers out planting churches in about 130 countries of the world. That's great, but I wish there were more, right? That's all wonderful, people say, but I wonder, I'm already giving 10% of my income for tithe, if you're following Malachi 3:10 anyway. You're giving 10% of your income for tithe. They say, what happens to that money? Doesn't some of that money go to frontline mission? The answer is no, not really. At least because of the way that we think of mission. We don't usually think of frontline mission. That's not the way that let me say that again. It doesn't really go to mission the way that we normally think of frontline mission. One of the things that I actually appreciate about the way our church works is that we are very careful with tithe. Most churches don't tithe at all, and those that do just use it for operating anyway. But the Bible is very specific about the way that tithe is supposed to be used. If you read in the Old Testament, the tithe was used to fund the priests and the Levites so that they could put full time into ministry. They didn't have to go work in the fields and the markets because the tithe paid them so that they could be the full-time pastors of the people. You remember when it was time to build the Old Testament sanctuary? They didn't use the tithe. Moses called the people to bring free will offerings, and they responded. They brought it until he had to tell them to stop. But that was because the sanctuary was not to be built with tithe. That's why we are able to have pastors even in small churches, because we share that load and we pay the pastors with tithe. The Adventist church continues that biblical mandate. And God has blessed because of it. So generally speaking, when you return your tithe, as God commands us to in Malachi, you're funding ministers and sometimes evangelistic type things, but they are not operations, not buildings, not infrastructure. That's not what happens with tithe. One of these free will offerings within the Seventh-day Adventist Church anyway is called the world budget. If you take out one of the envelopes in your pew and open it up, you'll see a line that says world budget on it. There's another name for that. It's called the mission offering. And in some conferences, you will find that actually written on the mission envelope. On the envelope there. But we don't here in Minnesota conference. But it is the same thing, and part of the reason that we don't call it that is because of what we normally think of as mission. People give to the mission offering, and they usually think of a missionary with a picture roll in front of a grass hut, right? And when your money is put into the mission offering and it doesn't go there, people say, why? So to clarify, we call it the world budget. It goes for lots of different things. The world budget is the lifeblood of everything our church does outside of funding full-time ministers. Okay? Sometimes people, in fact, often people call my office asking, what does the mission offering go for? Please tell me what the mission offering goes for. And whenever I get that call, which is regular, I just kind of, oh. That's kind of like asking what happens with the water of the Mississippi River. The explanation would fill volumes. Not all of it goes into the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of it goes out and waters our trees here, right? To describe what happens with the mission offering would be a huge task. The World Budget Mission Offering is the river that feeds the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The mission offering is what goes to fund missionaries that do go overseas but are not pastors, and so they're not paid with tithe. It goes to fund things like the seminaries that we operate around the world, or certain organizations that are owned by the church, like Loma Linda University, for example. All of these things are mission-related things that happen within our church. The mission offering funds buildings sometimes. It funds teachers in our schools and 1,001 other things. So when the world budget or the mission offerings do not increase when membership increases, which has been the case since who knows when, our entire church suffers. Because just like the land suffers when rivers begin to run dry, it's the same thing that happens in our church. I would encourage you, when you pull out that tithe envelope, recognize what world budget means. We have plenty of resources in the Seventh-day Adventist Church for finishing this work. The mission that God has given the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not even close to being finished in some parts of this world. And we have the resources to do it. The thing is that, for the most part, we're hanging on to them. We're not using them the way that God would like for us to. And each one of us is going to answer for this one day. I want to share with you a quote from Testimonies Volume 2, page 518. And she writes, "I was shown that the recording angel makes a faithful record of every offering." So imagine this. There's an angel up in heaven. He's got a PC, right, with a spreadsheet. He's got a Mac with a PC on it. I mean, with a spreadsheet on it. And it's got columns and rows. And on one row it says Pastor Jeff. And then there's a column that says faithful offering. Okay, check. That's column 1. Now, I was shown that the recording angel makes a faithful record of every offering dedicated to God and, column number 2, put into the treasury. Check. Or maybe it says he gave it to a beggar on the street. That's an offering, right? Or maybe Jeff knew about a project in Lebanon for the Syrian refugees and he gave something direct to that. Okay, that's fine, I do that. And, he writes that there. But he's got a special column for offerings put into the treasury. You know what another name for that is in our church? It's kind of become called that. I've heard it many times. A black hole. You know why people say that? Because they don't know what happens with the money. But listen to what this goes on to say here. So we've got column number 1, a faithful record of every offering. Column number 2, put into the treasury. And also, this is interesting, the final result of the means thus bestowed. It's true, we don't know what happens to it when it goes into the mission offering because it's so big, you can't keep track of every penny that goes, where it happens to go. But God does. And He is going to tell you someday what happened with it. Just like the widow, she put in her 2 mites, she has no idea the effect that it has had from then until now, and neither do we. But we're going to know someday. So that's pretty cool. And then, the eye of God takes cognizance of every farthing devoted to His cause, and of the, next column, the willingness or the reluctance of the giver. You going to want to see this spreadsheet someday? He takes cognizance, the willingness and reluctance of every giver, and then, next column, the motive in giving is also chronicled. Wow, incredible. These self-sacrificing, consecrated ones who render back to God the things that are His, as He requires of them, will be rewarded according to their works. Now get this one. Even though the means thus consecrated be misapplied. I get that call often at my office too. I don't want to give to the mission offering because I'm afraid it's going to be stolen, or I'm afraid it's going to be put into the wrong place, or I don't think it should be used in this way, or I blah, 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 blah. What I'm seeing here is that God actually understands that it will happen that things will be misapplied, money will be misapplied. It might happen. I think it happens a whole lot less than we think. But you know who's going to answer for when it's misapplied? You know who? The person that misapplied it, not the person that gave it. God still says, put it into the treasury. That doesn't mean that you can't give to a project. It doesn't mean you should. But there's the treasury too, and if it dries up, the work can't go on. Because what happens when we put the money to where we know, what happens to the things that nobody knows about? There's a whole sermon in just this. And guess what? I'm not going in that direction today. I heard a sigh of relief out there somewhere, right? People don't like this. I know, I understand, because I don't either. I wanted to bring you up to date on some mission realities. Okay, I'm done. For the sermon, we need to go to the Scriptures. We need to open up the Bible and hear what God has to say from His Word. But since we are thinking about mission today, I chose two stories in the Bible that can illustrate a particular aspect of mission that our church has historically ignored. We haven't done that well on it. The first story is the story of Lot in Genesis 13 and 19. You'll remember that in the story, Abraham and Lot needed to separate because they had too much to be able to live that close together. They needed more space. And so Abraham told Lot to take the first choice. Look out over the land, pick the spot that you want to settle, and he would go somewhere else. Genesis 13:12 tells us that Abram lived in the land of Canaan, and Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. And then later we know that he moved into the city itself. Now, we're often critical of Lot, not only for choosing the best for himself, but also for moving into the big bad, wicked city, right? But this does not mean that Lot was a wicked man himself. In fact, the Bible says the opposite. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7, it says he was a righteous man who was distressed by the filthy lives of lawless men. Being distressed by the filthy lives of lawless men sounds to me like Lot was something of a positive influence on Sodom. You with me? We don't usually think of it this way, but God was using Lot to try to effect some changes in Sodom. Why would God waste an opportunity of a righteous man living there? He wouldn't. Because God did not want to destroy Sodom. We know from the story that God was open to any reason that He could find not to destroy Sodom. That's why He was willing, when Abraham asked Him to spare the city for only 10 righteous people, He was willing to say, okay. And you noticed who stopped asking? It was Abraham who stopped, not God who told him to stop. I often wonder what would have happened if he kept asking. What if only 5 righteous people were there? What if there's only one? I don't know what God would have said, but I do know that God hadn't stopped him. God would have loved to save Sodom. God cares about the cities. And so He does not destroy without sending warning after warning after warning. He hopes people will listen and repent and be saved. Part of God's warning for Sodom was Lot. Now, maybe Lot was ineffective. That's not for me to judge, but it doesn't seem to be for lack of trying. Look at Genesis 19, beginning of the first verse. Genesis 19. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them, and he bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go on your way in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. We know why he insisted so strongly, right? Lot knew the violence that the wicked men of Sodom were capable of. So and presumably this was not an isolated incident for Lot. He didn't just wake up that morning and say, "Today, for the first time, I'm going to invite somebody to my house." Lot had a spot at the city gate. I get the feeling that he probably invited strangers to his house more than once for a safe place to stay. Lot was doing something good for Sodom. He had turned his house into an urban center of influence because he saw a need, and he was doing what he could to protect innocent travelers from the wicked inhabitants of the city. Good for him. In Lot, God provided a final warning for Sodom. Even to the last minute, the warning went out because the angel sent Lot out to the city to try to get his sons-in-law and probably anybody else that would come to get out of the city and be saved. But Sodom did not heed the warning, and they finally faced the judgment of God. One point that we can take away from the story of Sodom is that God cared about the city. God cared about the city. This is illustrated not only by the fact that he was so willing to listen to Abraham's request for leniency, but also because he came personally to check out the situation. He put himself in Abraham's way just so Abraham could defend the people. He didn't have to come there and tell Abraham what he was doing. And he also came to rescue Lot and any who would come with him. That's why he sent Lot with a final warning to the people before physically pulling him out of town. God had created the people of Sodom, and he loved the people of Sodom. And he was concerned for the people of that city. So up to the last minute, God sent them opportunities to be saved. Now, let's switch stories. We don't usually connect these stories, but let's switch stories to another big city that God was concerned about. In fact, he cared so much about it, there's a whole book of the Bible dedicated to it. Turn to the book of Jonah. The book of Jonah, start at the very beginning. Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. God called Nineveh a great city because it was a great city. We later learned that a visit required 3 days and more than 120,000 people lived there. Nineveh had been built by Nimrod after the Tower of Babel. And so even in Jonah's day, Nineveh was an ancient city. So for the times, Nineveh was one of the great cities of earth. But as with all big cities, the spiritual situation was dire. In fact, the situation was so dreadful that Nineveh, like Sodom, was nearing its limit. Its cup was nearly full, as the Bible calls it, and judgment was pending. But again, God does not destroy without warning, because he is concerned about the city. So he ordered, notice he did not ask Jonah, he ordered Jonah to go on a mission to that city. Told him to go. And Jonah didn't like the idea. Nineveh was the capital of the cruel Assyrians, and probably Jonah was absolutely terrified of them. And probably he was also angry at them for the atrocities that they had committed against his people. If you've ever done any research on the Assyrian methods of warfare, it was awful. And Jonah was well aware of this. Jonah decidedly did not share God's concern for the city of Nineveh. So when God sent him on a mission to the city, Jonah didn't want to go. He didn't want to go so much that verse 3 says that Jonah ran away from the Lord. He ran away, headed for Tarshish. He went to Joppa, found a ship bound out of that port. For that port, after paying the fare, he went aboard and he sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Think about that. Jonah was a prophet of God, a special messenger, specially called by God, just like you and I are. And when he sent Jonah on a mission to the city, he refused. Jonah told God no. Pretty bold of Jonah, wouldn't you say? To disobey a direct order from God to go work in the city. God, in his mercy, both on Nineveh and on Jonah, didn't allow Jonah to run away. You know the story. God had Jonah thrown over the side of the ship. And then he sent a big old fish to come and swallow Jonah until Jonah was ready to listen. And then God told the fish to go and spit a slimy Jonah out onto the beach. You ever really think through the details of this story? It's really quite funny if you think about them. Then the word of the Lord, chapter 3, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. God wasn't going to give up on his Nineveh. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message that I give you. Refusing to warn the city was not one of the options that God gave to Jonah. And it took some trauma for Jonah to figure that out, to accept it. And I wonder sometimes, how much trauma will it take for you and I to accept God's mission to the cities? How much trauma will it take? Because refusing to go is not one of the options. But Pastor, I'm not Jonah. God isn't calling me to... Yes, He is. Yes, He is. We are God's warning to the people by the virtue of the fact that we live here. That's it. We have a mission to the cities that are within our reach. How much trauma will it take for us to believe that God is serious? Fortunately, God got through to Jonah. And even though his heart wasn't in it, he did obey. Verse 3. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord, and he went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was a very important city. A visit required 3 days. On the first day, Jonah started into the city, and he proclaimed, 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overturned. Now, the next verse, verse 5, is an incredible statement. Because remember, this city, like Sodom, was on the brink of destruction for its wickedness. There was so little chance of them responding to God. At this point in their history, they had ignored everything else before this. Why now? And yet, unlike Sodom, look at what happened. The Ninevites believed God. Verse 5. The Ninevites believed God. They declared a fast, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he arose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. Kings didn't do that. Then he issued a proclamation in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let any man or beast, herd or flock taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. You get the feeling he's serious? Let man and beast be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone urgently call on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Let this sink in. This is amazing stuff. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Jonah's half-hearted half-hearted mission to the city worked. It worked in spite of Jonah. The people listened, and they seriously repented, and it was enough to buy them more time. Verse 10, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion, and he did not bring upon them the destruction that he had threatened. That's why Mosul in Iraq is still in the news, because Mosul is the same city as Nineveh. Did you know that? It is. That's why you don't hear about Sodom in the news, because Sodom was obliterated. But the people of Nineveh repented, and their sentence was withdrawn. And what was Jonah's reaction? Was he overjoyed at his success because now he shared God's concern for the city? No. No. Verse 1 of chapter 4, Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. Greatly displeased and became angry. Jonah was not concerned for the city. He could care less. That's why he could refuse God. He could care less. He was much more interested in other things. Like for his reputation as a prophet, for instance. He was right now, he was going to be seen as a false prophet. And so he prayed to the Lord. What a prayer. Verse 2. O Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? This is why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love. This all comes from Exodus. And God who relents from sending calamity. Now, O Lord, take away my life. It is better for me to die than live. Because you're a God of love, I just can't stand it. I mean, that's what he was saying. Not even realizing that he was alive because of the same God of love. Jonah knew that God was concerned for the city, and yet he still didn't want to go on this mission of mercy that God sent him to do. So in his mercy on Jonah, God worked a little parable for him. He caused a vine to grow up overnight, and it covered Jonah, and it gave him nice shade from the heat of the sun, and Jonah liked it. But then God sent a little worm and ate the bottom of that little vine and killed it, and then God cranked up the thermostat on the sun, which made Jonah miserable and furious. You ever wonder why God was so patient with Jonah? Ugh. God said to Jonah, verse 9, do you have any right to be angry about the vine? I do, he said. He stomped his foot. I'm pretty sure he did. I do, he said. I'm angry enough to die. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this vine, the plant. You've been concerned about this vine, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight, it died overnight. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about this city? Man, can you hear God's heart in this? Should I not be concerned about that great city? Do you think that God is any less concerned about the cities today than he was back then? If anything, he's more concerned because the cities are even greater today than they were back then. We think of a visit being 3 days and 120,000 people. I mean, that's tiny. Minneapolis is what? 1.5 million or better? I don't even know how many it is, Minneapolis. Do you know about that? Okay. If anything, he is more concerned about the cities today because the cities are filled with people that Jesus died for, and they don't know their right hand from their left. More than half the world's population, 8 billion people, half of those are now urban dwellers. And they say that within the next 15 years it's going to grow to 2/3. There is a massive urbanization taking place on planet Earth. Not just in the U.S., this is everywhere. That means that most of the people that God wants in his kingdom are living in the cities. Most of them. Seventh-day Adventist Church is largely a rural church. we don't do well in the cities. Our methods are geared for another time and another place. Why haven't we updated? Why aren't we working more in the cities? Could it be that we do not share God's concern? Could it be that we prefer to go anywhere else other than Nineveh? This isn't a new problem in our church, by the way. Ellen White had strong words to say about our neglect of the cities. Here's just one of many quotes. This one comes from Evangelism, page 37. Time is rapidly passing into eternity when these cities have as yet scarcely been touched. There is a power that the Spirit of God can impart to truth. As light is flashed into the mind, a conviction will take hold of hearts that will be too powerful to resist. Guess what happened in Nineveh? That's what happened, right? My duty is to say that God is earnestly calling for a great work to be done in the cities. New fields are to be opened. Men who know the message and should feel the responsibilities of the work have manifested so little faith that because of difficulties or fears, there has been long neglect. I remember someone telling a story sometime back. I don't remember, I think it was Mark Finley or Sean Boonstra, but I'm not sure about that. But anyway, they told how they dumped thousands and thousands of dollars into a big evangelistic campaign in Chicago. I think it was like close to $100,000 or something. It was huge. Opening night, 8 people came. Obviously, they wondered what had happened, and so they hired a firm to study it. And the firm came back and they said, "We figured it out. We discovered that there are 12 people in Chicago that have an interest in Bible prophecy. You got 8 of them. Your advertising was a phenomenal success. You got the majority of the people that were interested in your topic." Wow. The point is that the old methods of mass evangelism are increasingly less effective in the cities. Now, I'm not against mass evangelism. There are places and times that it still works, even in the cities. If you're going to go do an evangelistic series, God bless you, go for it. That's fine. But the cities are increasingly different. And I don't claim to be an expert in the evangelism field, but I am suspecting that more and more the cities will not be reached by mass evangelism. The people in the cities must be reached one by one, the way Jesus did it, by mingling with the people as one desiring their good, meeting their needs, healing, caring, developing relationships, and then finally bidding them to follow. This is why Global Mission, the office I work for, is helping to start urban centers of influence in cities around the world. We're dumping millions of dollars into projects and people that are willing to start these centers in large urban areas. In many, if not most, urban situations, people just won't set foot inside a church that's not their own. They think they know what is there, and they are not interested. Urban centers of influence, on the other hand, are neutral ground. People are not threatened by a restaurant or a clinic or a community center or a child care center or what have you. What they recognize is that they have a need, and here's a way to meet it. When the people that are running a center of influence intentionally use the opportunities provided by these circumstances to build a relationship with people over time, the walls begin to come down, and people begin to trust them with their deeper needs, their spiritual needs. And then we are in a position of trust to be able to help answer their questions. Centers of influence, correctly run, is evangelism at its finest. And it's directly geared for the cities where personal relationships are the key factor to drawing people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. Is anyone in here cringing besides me? I hope not. You're better than me if you are. The idea of personally developing relations with people, does that frighten you? I ask because it frightens me. I'm an introvert. I have a hard time meeting people. And besides, when I think of getting involved in people's lives that way, I'm looking for the next boat to Tarshish. Because being involved in people's lives that way is messy. It causes inconvenience. It requires emotional energy. It requires my time and my money. And like Jonah, we don't want to do it. We would prefer to watch TV or whatever it is we do in our spare time. Why is that? Could it be that we don't share God's concern for the cities? Could that be it? For most of us, we prefer to do ministry from a distance. Somebody once very aptly said, I'll pray and I'll pay, but you go. For disciples of Jesus, ministry cannot be done effectively from a distance. And yet God is not asking us. He has commanded us to go to the people of the cities. What kind of trauma will it take to get our attention and to make us obey? What will it take for us to develop that kind of concern for the people around us that God has for Nineveh and LA and New York and the Twin Cities? We have a job to do. We have a mission to this city because Judgment Day is near. Nearer probably than most of us think. God needs you. He needs me to do what He has told us to do. Being where you are today, you have the ability to start a center of influence of some sort right here. We have everything that we need. Everything that we need to start new groups of believers in this part of the Twin Cities. Except for one thing, apparently. Concern for the people who will soon die in their wickedness. Jesus is concerned for the people of this city. Should you and I not be concerned as well? If so, my question to leave you with is, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Let's